So hi there, everyone. My name is Scott Nicholson, and I'm a professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in Brantford, Ontario. I'm the professor of the game design program, and I teach game design, and we focus on games that change the world. We focus on games that aren't about killing people, but other sorts of games. And one of my specialties is in the world of escape rooms. And so this collaboration with Red Bull, they have Red Bull Mind Gamers, provided us with the funding to hire someone for 2 years to work with us to do research on cultural bias in escape room design. And the person that we hired and we've been working with now for about a year and a half is Shannon McDowell. Shannon?
Hi, I'm Shannon McDowell, and I'm a research associate at Wilfrid Laurier University. So I have been spending my time the last year and a half researching cultural bias in escape room design. So my background is in international relations and cross-cultural communication, and I'm also a game designer and escape room enthusiast. So this is my dream job.
And so for this particular project has gotten interesting over the last just few months, because we started by looking at wanting to look at cultural bias in escape room design to do a better job with the World Championships. Because when we did the first World Championships and designed those in 2017, we made some errors around introducing cultural bias into the games. What then happened is we looked at that and said, hey, we had some problems, and approached Red Bull to say, could you fund someone to help us do research so we don't do this again? So Shannon got involved and went to the World Championships in 2019, began talking with players there, and continued talking with players. So I'm going to go away now for a little while, and we're going to go away there, and so we'll let Shannon talk.
All right, so yeah, like Scott said, our purpose was to look at instances of cultural bias in escape rooms and really determine the effect of cultural bias on players' enjoyment of the game. So, there's cultural bias in escape rooms. There's cultural bias in everything. You can't really help that. But what does it look like in escape rooms, and how can we reduce it or make a better experience for players? So in my research, I created this definition where cultural bias in escape rooms occurs when a game designer assumes a degree of common knowledge based on their own cultural standards. So this is common knowledge, outside knowledge, you might hear it called in escape room circles, but it's not just that. There's a lot of cultural customs and things that you don't even realize are cultural biases until you start to get into this. So how we did this is I interviewed 33 escape room enthusiasts and the Red Bull Escape Room World Championship competitors. And there were about 30-minute interviews. And it was really interesting because, so of the enthusiasts I interviewed, there was an average of, 265 rooms per plate per person. Removing the two outliers of about 1,300 rooms, I'm sure some of you can guess who those are. We came out with an average of just under 200 rooms per player that I interviewed. So these are some experienced players. About 30-minute interviews. And from that, I gathered player experiences of the rooms that they played in multiple countries. So everyone I interviewed has played escape rooms in at least 2 countries. Most of them were more. So you can see we had the breakdown: 17 from North America, 11 from Europe, 2 interviewed from Asia, and 2 from Australia Pacific area. So yeah, so that's basically what we went through. Limitations, of course, this is a small sample size, so this isn't necessarily going to be representative if we do these interviews on a broader scale with more players. Also, an interesting thing that came up, I did not ask a question about this, but unprompted, 42% of the players that I interviewed told me that they research before travel to make sure that they only play the good rooms. So in this case, enthusiasts, they're traveling to play escape rooms. Or if they're in a city, they're traveling and doing escape rooms as they travel. So because it's a limited time that they have to play rooms, they don't want to get caught up in the bad ones. So that's not 40% of all players, because I didn't ask about this. This is just 42% of the players who told me this without me asking about it. So very interesting there. We also didn't collect a lot of demographic information. So we collected where players were from, like specific countries, but we didn't collect gender, age, race, all that other demographic stuff that could lead to a bit deeper information or data.
Now, one of the things that I did is some analysis to look to see, of all the demographic information we did collect, what correlated with people's mentions of problems in escape room design. And I had gone in with a hypothesis that it would be the numbers of rooms played. The people who had played more rooms would have more incidents of cultural bias in escape rooms. I did not find that to be the strongest correlation there. There was a correlation there, but it was quite weak. The strongest correlation of all the demographics that we found was actually based upon the number of different continents people played in. So people who played in fewer rooms, but in more different continents, were more likely to give us more incidents. And you can see the pretty significant difference between these different groups of people that played in 4 continents as compared to 3 and to 2 and to 1. Now, in some ways, that's a oh no duh finding, because that is what you would expect, that people who have played more widely are going to run into more incidents of cultural bias in escape rooms. Now, one of the things we asked about was with specific knowledge in games, when you ran into issues, was this a positive thing if the game required specific knowledge? Was it a neutral thing, or was it a negative thing? And that was one of the questions we want to know. And interestingly enough, what we found is that in our folks from North America, about 25% of the time, they said that it was actually a positive thing when they were required to have specific knowledge in a game, as compared to our players from everywhere else who felt as it was either neutral or a negative aspect to have this need for specific knowledge in game. Shannon, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So what I saw a lot of from the North American respondents who said it was a positive thing is they were looking at it as they were traveling. This is another experience. So they're traveling and they want to see more of different cultures. So when they come across those moments of cultural bias, it's not seen as a negative, it's seen as I'm now experiencing something new, something that I haven't experienced before back in North America. So that was very interesting. Very interesting too that, yeah, the only positive reactions were from North Americans. A lot fewer neutral responses when I asked the question, but in this case, it was very much, I think the quote here says it all, you know, it really depends on whether you succeed at it or not, whether you're happy with it or not. So, and I saw this from a wider range of players as well, is if they knew what the cultural reference was, they were fine. It was a great experience. They could be the hero for that moment of the room. But if they didn't know it, it was frustrating and terrible, and it impacted their enjoyment of the room. For the negative reactions, that's this quote here talks about how escape rooms are for entertainment, for enjoyment. So if you're being put in a situation where you can't get past the obstacle, then where's the fun? You know, and I heard a lot more phrases like it interrupts the flow. So players come across a cultural reference in a room and they think, oh, does the designer expect this to be common knowledge so that I'm supposed to just run through it? Or am I going to wait until later in the room for a hint to get through this, or for more information to come up in the room? So when you get into that circumstance where you're not sure what you're supposed to do next, you know, is this something that everyone in this area knows, then it can interrupt your flow and lead to you second guessing the rest of the room. So as we were going through all these experiences with players, we coded them all into different categories. So these are the 5 categories that we coded. So language, which was about 20% of the incidences. So symbols, norms, and values, which are 2 different things, but combine them into one category for escape rooms for this particular study. Artifacts, which are items in a room, and knowledge. So we'll be going through all of those and the subcategories in a lot more detail.
So we're going to start by talking about language and what we did, and you're going to see some data and then you're going to see some anecdotes, and we're going to bounce between the two. And so what you're seeing here, the numbers that you're seeing on the screen, are the percentages of out of all the incidents reported by people, what percentage fell into each category. So with language, we found that overall 20% of the incidents that were reported around cultural bias were related to language. And when we broke that up, we found that 15% of all the incidents reported were based on written language issues, and only about 5% were based around spoken written issues. Now, what you're going to see is as we get to each category, you're going to see we broke that up based on the continent that people came from. In this particular slide, they're all pretty similar, but there's going to be some slides down the road, some of the data pools, where there's some big differences based on where people come from. And that'll come out a little bit more with the stories behind the data. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those stories.
So I think these are some great stories as far as language. So for spoken language, someone gave me the example of they were in a room where you had to interact with a character, with an actor. This actor was not fluent in English. So they had to be very, very careful about how they were phrasing their questions, because if they didn't use the exact right words, then the actor or the character they were interacting with didn't understand what they were asking and they didn't get the information they needed. So spoken language, this really comes across in misunderstanding the instructions for the room, misunderstanding hints from the GM, or in interactions with actors. So that's where you really find the spoken language. You could also sometimes see it in audio that's played in the room if there's a background audio that may include some information that the players need to know. If they're not specifically listening because it's either not their native language or it's a poor translation, something like that, then that's where you could see problems. I thought this was a great example for written language too. So a puzzle in China where you had to write the Chinese character, but the stroke order was important. So they expected the person solving the puzzle to know what the stroke order is for writing the Chinese character. That's interesting because if you are not a Chinese speaker doing a room in China and you come across this puzzle, that's going to be very difficult. You'll also, there were a lot of examples of language, and a lot of them are involved inaccurate translations. So maybe the room has been translated to English from another language or from English to another language. And that causes problems for the players. And another thing that was interesting was a lot of the opposite example. So maybe there is a puzzle in the room that's written in Russian, and you have to translate that to English to get the right answer. And so maybe the room provides a dictionary or something like that. Well, if you got someone in that room who already speaks Russian, then they're going to skip right past that puzzle. So it's an interesting opposite example of what could come about when you're working with language in an escape room.
And that demonstrates one of the problems also when the players know more than they should know when they're attacking a problem. So if that Russian speaker understands Russian and English, that they come to this issue of translation, they're supposed to use a dictionary and find the one word the dictionary says is the translation, but they know all these other words, and they're going to get frustrated because they know more than they really should for doing the puzzle. And that's a problem with basing your assumption that people don't know something when they come into the room.
Yeah, there was another great example that a player gave me where they were in a room and they found a scrap of newspaper that had something on it and it was written in German. And this was a room, I think, in the US or something like that. And they were reading and they were going, oh, I speak German. I can interpret this. And they were crouched around this scrap of paper trying to figure out what it meant. Well, they finally got into the next room in the escape room and realized that there were scraps of newspaper in all kinds of languages all over the room. And it was clearly junk and didn't mean anything. But because they could read German, they spent all that time on this scrap piece of paper thinking that it was an important clue. All right, symbols. So symbols are an interesting thing. So in this case, we divided into 3 categories: gestures, icons, and objects. So symbols are things that stand for something else.
Now, looking at the data on this, we found that about 9% of the time, 9% of the incidents were based around issues with symbols. We found no one reported incidents around gestures. But for gestures, actually, we would point to our first work in this research series. So the first piece that we put out, and you can find this over at BGNlab.ca, was about how escape room owners can create audio video content for their rooms, media for their rooms that is not culturally biased. And in that, we talk about the importance of not using gestures that are culturally biased. But there wasn't anyone in the study that reported that. We did find that people from Europe were less likely to report issues with symbols in general. But yeah, do you want to talk a little bit more about what we found with gestures and the media?
Sure. So I have some examples here too, but some of the main ones are gestures that you may think are positive, like a thumbs up or V for victory or various other gestures may be positive in some cultures, but a negative gesture or offensive gesture in others. So it's something to be aware of if you have players interacting with actors or you have videos that are trying to communicate something. Other examples of nonverbal communication, which is all gestures are, is like sign language. Sign language is a language in and of itself, even though it's gestures, and it differs from country to country. So if you're using sign language, you have to realize that people coming from other countries will have different versions of sign language that they're familiar with. Indicating numbers, counting on your fingers, looks different in different countries. People start on different fingers. And interactions with actors. One thing that we mentioned in our media video was facial expressions. There are certain facial expressions that are common between all cultures. So those are easy to include. You know that they'll be understood, but some more subtle expressions may not be. Okay, icons as symbols. So icons are pictures or symbols that represent an object, idea, or emotion. So this was an interesting example where Roman numerals were used in a room, but not as numbers. So they were just meant to be visual symbols. So no one would try to read them as numbers. And I'm like, that is a very strange example. But you will see symbols a lot in escape rooms, whether it's a made up code. There's lots of codes that are icons, like semaphore, pig pen. Those are common ones that you'll see in escape rooms. Emojis are also icons. I don't want to get into examples there because I'm not sure I know any clean ones. But
well, that's a great example of why you can't use an emoji in a room
yes.
and assume people know what that emoji is supposed to mean and how that should be used. I did one room that had emojis as part of the puzzle, and they had different emojis, and you had to have positive and negative emotions related to those emojis. And if you didn't know what those emojis were, is poop a positive or a negative emotion?
That's true. The amount of people who look at the emoji where someone's crying with laughter and then say, what's wrong? And yeah. So objects that represent a word, idea or emotion. So this could have gone under artifacts, and a lot of times the puzzles that include objects also include other types of cultural biases. So for example, in this puzzle, the player had to take pictures of, you know, an elephant or a cashew or a squid, and they were trying to make famous London pubs. So in this case, knowing the names of famous London pubs would go under knowledge and trivia later on. But being able to identify the pictures is, you know, recognizing objects. And there's other examples of this too. I had several people mention an example in Chinese designed rooms where they saw the monkeys doing, you know, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. So making the gestures, and you had to put them in order, these objects. Well, first, you have to recognize that these objects are representing this concept of, you know, see no evil, hear no evil. And then you have to know the order. So knowing the order is trivia, but recognizing those objects and their importance, those objects are a symbol in that case. All right, norms and values. These are some of the more interesting ones. So norms are standards and expectations of behavior, and values are judgments of what's good and bad. So these are really some of the ones that you can really dive into because they're not necessarily puzzle related. Some of them are behavior of players in escape rooms or what they're expected to do. So we've got folkways and customs, mores and laws, taboos, rituals, and genres. And folkways is probably my favorite new word that I learned while doing this research.
I'm trying to unmute here.
You're unmuted.
There we go. All right. So looking at the percentages here of where people fell. So again, 10% of the 10% of the incidents were around norms and values and those concepts. And what was interesting is, again, it was less likely that people from Europe would report issues with norms and values, but our two people from who came out of Asia had many more issues with norms and values. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Some of this will come up in the specific examples, but we don't have a reason necessarily for this. I don't want to read too much into it with such a small sample size, but my guess might be that the Europeans tended to play a lot of rooms in Europe as well as on other continents. So it's possible that maybe it's just a greater familiarity or with these other cultures that they're encountering because they're all so close. That's my best guess. With Asia, most of their experiences with other genres were in other countries and on other continents. So that was more, they weren't familiar with the storylines that would be common to the countries that they were playing games in. So folkways and customs. So folkways and customs are informal standards of behavior. So these are things that more involve the experience of the player in the room, as well as puzzles. So interesting example in Spain. So this player had a few experiences where they would pin your arms to your chest and frog march you quite rapidly. And they commented on how this was startling and quite uncomfortable for some people who aren't used to that kind of physical contact. And this came up from a few different players about the personal space that was expected in rooms and what was considered normal behavior in rooms. So for example, in Russia, a lot of rooms will give you levels of intensity. So before you go into a room, you can choose what level of intensity you want it to be. So do you want the actors to be shoving you around the space and to lock you into small areas, or do you want it to be completely hands off? So that's an interesting cultural custom there. This can also involve puzzles, though. Players are expected to know certain standards of behavior and perform them, and then that allows them to solve a puzzle. So, for example, a player mentioned a room in Japan where you had to make sure to take your shoes off before entering the room. And if everyone had their shoes off, then something unlocked. So, very interesting experiences there. For mores and laws, that involves formal behavior codes. So in escape rooms, you see this mostly as safety regulations and escape room codes of conduct. So again, involving the behavior of players rather than specific puzzles. For safety regulations, different countries have different expectations as to what safety means and different laws around safety. So this might equal different behavior in rooms from players because they're not sure what is safe and what they're expected to do. So for example, a player from a country where they have higher or tighter safety regulations may not be willing or may not think they're supposed to climb a rickety ladder up to another level in the escape room in a country that doesn't have as strict regulations. So you can see these different examples. For codes of conduct, I had one player tell me about a situation where they were given the escape room code of conduct in the introduction, in the briefing, and they were told not to do specific things, keep both feet on the ground, don't damage anything, that kind of regular briefing that you get in many rooms. But it turns out that something that they had to do in the room resulted in them purposefully breaking the rules of the escape room code of conduct. So this was difficult for them because they didn't know. They're like, okay, well, we need to do this to get past this puzzle, but that would result in us doing something they told us specifically not to do. But it turns out in that room, they wanted them to actually break the rules. And that led to second guessing for the rest of the room because they weren't sure, is this when we're supposed to break rules again? Right, taboos. So taboos are strongly discouraged behavior or actions in a culture. So again, this varies culture to culture. And I just want to say straight off that taboos are not necessarily bad things, but they are things that may take players aback or cause them to hesitate. So for example, the first quote is about a game that included a Jewish spy, and there was a puzzle, and from the perspective of the players, the answer was a little, not quite anti-Semitic, but maybe not quite appropriate from their perspective. So they paused on that puzzle and were hesitant to answer it because they thought the answer couldn't be right because someone wouldn't say that. Another example from a Canadian point of view of playing a game in the US was interacting with a gun. And as a Canadian myself, I get the hesitation on touching a gun because culturally we're told not to. Whereas in the US, it's a little more common to be exposed to firearms. So interesting examples there too. Also, you'll see, as far as taboos, you'll also see rooms that are 18 plus or, various rooms about drugs or alcohol or, other things that you wouldn't normally expect and that are not family friendly. So not necessarily, again, these aren't bad, but there's just things to be aware of because cultural taboos will cause players to hesitate. So rituals. This is another area where we didn't have any examples from the interviews, but I have seen these come up, rituals come up as knowledge that you need to know in escape rooms. So these are established procedures and ceremonies. And you'll see this, weddings, birthday parties. These are all celebrated differently in different cultures, and there's different traditions that go along with them. So you need to be aware that some players playing your room will not be familiar with those traditions. All right, genres. So this is a fun one. So this is one that Scott originally suggested when we were talking about what categories to use. And of course, genres is very specific to escape rooms. This is not something you see in other cultural analyses. And I was skeptical. I didn't actually think that we would find examples of this, and it turns out there are several examples of this. So he was right, I was not. This is very interesting because this is looking at theme and narrative in your escape room. Stories, are stories universal? Well, it turns out they're not, and themes often rely on the stories. So from what I found in the interviews, this came about most often with very thematic and immersive games where players didn't feel like they were understanding everything that happened. So Houdini as the first example. The person playing the game did not know who Houdini was and wasn't familiar with magicians and magic tricks. So that made the story hard to understand. The second example is someone doing a science fiction game who had never watched science fiction before. So wasn't familiar with what was going on, didn't get a lot of the jokes. I have examples of this. Scott and I played a game in London that was based on the Sherlock TV show. And I think I was the only one in our group of players who had actually seen every episode of the TV show, which made me enjoy all the little Easter eggs, but made Scott say, "Why are all these British people yelling at me?"
And that's exactly how I felt. The room was just a bunch of British people yelling at me, and I can get that just going in the tube. I didn't need to go to an escape room for that experience.
Right. And so I was enjoying it because I was getting all of the little details. But for someone who hasn't watched the show, that's all lost. And you don't get the full experience of the room. Okay, and the next category that we looked at was artifacts. So these are specifically objects that make up a society's material culture. So for escape rooms, we divided this into 4 different sections. So sensory, tools, recreational, and media that we'll go into more detail with.
And when we broke down looking at where players came from, we found about 25% of the time the incidents reported were based around artifacts. They were pretty similar, although we found that folks from Europe were more likely to have incidents around sensory-based artifacts. Do you want to talk about what we mean by sensory artifacts?
Yeah, so sensory artifacts are objects interpreted through a sense. So smell, taste, touch, sound. These smell puzzles were very common here. So the example that I have on the slide is where they had to identify different alcohols by scent. And then a lot of people talked about identifying different spices or trying to sort between different citrus scents. And that's tough. Smell puzzles are very, culturally specific. Spices especially. If there's a spice that a specific country does not use or is very common, you can't expect that will hold true across all countries and all cultures. Sound as well. All of the examples I got through the interviews were all smell and sound examples. So being able to identify music, that was a big one. A song is played. What's the name of it? Who sang it? Being able to just identify the music is very difficult if you're not from that country, especially because all of the sound puzzles that I was given examples of were folk songs and not necessarily popular music, although even then popular music is dependent on what's the top 40s in the country where you are. All right, tools is the next category. The tools are defined as objects that assist a person in accomplishing another task. So there were several examples of tools. For example, light switches going the opposite direction in different countries. So in North America, for our light switches, up is on and down is off. Well, that's opposite in a lot of countries. So in the particular top example, that was the only puzzle they struggled with, and they ended up losing the game by 15 seconds because of that puzzle, because they didn't know that the light switches were backwards from what they were used to. The Singapore example is the example of a lock. And a lot of times, especially I know in Canada and the US, you see people, the GMs, go through the different locks in the room before you start. Do you know how to use this lock? Do you know how to use this lock? In Singapore, they didn't even bother because that particular keypad was in every single building. So everyone who lived there knew how to use it. But of course, if you're a visitor, then you wouldn't. A lot of the examples for this were locks that people weren't familiar with, or were assembling an item that is common in that country, but maybe not common outside of it. Knowing what type of chair needs to be placed in the sauna in a Nordic country, and knowing how to install batteries in a particular item, for example. Recreational objects, so objects that are meant for leisure or entertainment. In this case, I saw a lot of board games and video games. So chess, of course, that's the common example. I should probably have a stat for how many people that I interviewed mentioned chess as an example. If you don't know how to play chess, like me, then chess puzzles are difficult. You don't want to have to read through the rules of chess just to figure out how to solve a puzzle. The other example that I used here was the board game Battleship, which if you grew up with it, great. But if you didn't, that makes it difficult. There were a lot of board games and a lot of video games. So I guess the moral of the story is that this type of common knowledge is not common. Not everyone played the same games growing up. So media, so objects associated with mass communication. These were some of the interesting ones. So we're still talking about artifacts here. So this is not necessarily TV shows or pop culture knowledge. This is specifically using media artifacts. So like a Bible. So books are counted in this. Knowing how to use a dictionary or how to look things up in a Bible is not common knowledge. So there's also, yes, knowing how to use a computer. I definitely played a game where I had to order an item off of Amazon as part of the game. And great, as long as you know how to do that. Some people don't, or know how to look something up in a dictionary that's perhaps not in a language you're familiar with. Someone who is competent in speaking English, but maybe not writing as much, will have a harder time looking something up in an English dictionary. Knowledge. So this is a fun category that we added specifically for escape rooms. Information acquired by a person through experience or education. I think this was also the largest category of examples, if I remember.
Yeah, we found about 35% of all the incidents reported were based around knowledge, and the majority of those were trivia trivia knowledge that you had to have. What was interesting, a point of distinction here was around the concept of riddles, that players from North America were much more likely to report that they had incidents of cultural bias based on having riddles than players from Europe, as riddles are more part of the culture in the European culture than they are practiced in North America.
Yeah, trivia was definitely one of the big things. There were some interviews where players just could go and list all the specific trivia. So when I say trivia, I'm talking about specifically facts or pieces of information. And a lot of times when trivia is included in escape rooms, it's not obscure to the person designing it. These are probably things that they learned in school, things that they think are common knowledge. But if someone didn't have the same school experience or a background in the same culture, it's not common knowledge. So I like this example of you had to organize the files with the first color of the rainbow. So first, the trivia is you have to know the colors of the rainbow, and you have to know them in order. And again, that depends because there are actually several ways to order the rainbow. And the second example was knowing the date that Columbus sailed across the ocean. If you're not taught that in school and you don't know the little rhyme, then that's a difficult one. Again, I could have hundreds of examples of trivia that came up. You know, identifying actors, knowing the geography of an area, knowing where landmarks are located, knowing almost anything. There's a lot of trivia involved in escape rooms. And riddles. So when I say riddles, I'm not necessarily thinking of specifically riddles here, as you may think of them, but language-dependent wordplay. And my favorite quote about riddles is on this, that a player said, because you're not solving riddles, you're remembering riddles. And I think that's absolutely perfect because it's true. You can't necessarily, like, if you don't already know the answer to the riddle, you're not going to be able to solve it in the time pressure that an escape room puts you under. And wordplay as well. Several examples of that. This one in Poland where a player did not speak Polish and was completely pushed out of the game when there were puzzles with wordplay because his teammates or their teammates who did know Polish would just say, okay, go stand by the lock and enter what we call off. And that's it, because there's no possible way to solve wordplay puzzles if you don't speak the language. There were actually, I think, 3 or 4 players who brought up the same wordplay puzzle in French at a game in Canada. And the entire rest of the room was translated to English except for this one puzzle because the wordplay did not translate at all. So every English-only speaking player would get stuck on that puzzle.
So what the purpose of what we're presenting today is to take a look at the data that we came up with. And so this has been our first step, is to take these interviews and to describe, go through each interview, categorize the data, because our next step in this research is going to be to create best practices of how to avoid these things. But we need to start by finding incidents of these things. Now, what's interesting is things have changed in the last month and a half in the escape room world in an interesting way that makes this research a lot more relevant than it was when we started. When we started on this research because we wanted to do a better job at making a world championship that would not be biased. Now, however, there are over 100 escape rooms that you can play virtually in. Some of those are going to be in other continents. So we have now, we're adding a new layer of our research. And so the next step that we're going to be doing with our research is to do a larger scale survey of players who have played remote escape rooms to gather these same kind of incidents and stories from them. because we've realized that while the first survey looked at these enthusiasts who had traveled to play, now we have a much bigger audience of people who are able to play games in other continents from their computers. And so we want to collect that data and see, are we seeing the same issues, or are companies doing a better job at regionalizing games, at removing cultural bias? But we're at a time now where companies are throwing their games online very quickly, but maybe not thinking through the implications of having players from other cultures engage with them in their rooms. So we're going to be doing, right now we are beta testing the survey. The survey has to be approved through the university, and then we're going to put that survey out to get people to tell us about incidents they've had in their remote play rooms. The next step, which will be in the next few months, is we're going to do a presentation like this that will be about best practices. So we're going to take each category and talk about, well, how do you identify those best practices that will help you to do a better job in designing your rooms. And then the third part is a formal academic paper, which presents the data that you've just seen integrated with the model that we've come up with, as well as the best practices, and put that all together. And if you want to keep up with all of that, if you want to know when these things are out, we have an email list. You can find that if you go to bgnlab.ca. That's our blog. I'll always post things about these different talks on our blog. But I've got a URL there on the screen at tinyurl.com/erbias. And you can it's a survey with one question, tell us your email address, and I will send out an email when we hit each of these stages. So if you want to be involved, if you want to be informed in what's going on, give us your email address and we'll make sure and do that. So we're now hitting the end of our presentation. And so, Shannon, so what do you see as, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. But what do you see as how we're going to move forward with taking this knowledge in these virtual escape rooms? Do you have any advice for owners out there right now that are starting to make their rooms, what they should be thinking about? A little teaser of what best practices we'll be talking about?
Well, I think the main thing is just to be aware that what you think is common knowledge and normal isn't. The big problem with this is you don't know what you don't know. And so if something is normal to you, it's really, really difficult to go past that internal bias that you have and figure out, all right, how will this look like? What would this look like to someone else from a different culture? So I think one of the biggest tips I can give is, if you're planning a virtual or a remote escape room, is get as many people to beta test from different continents as you can. And that'll be most likely to uncover any of these internal biases that you didn't realize were included in your design.
So there is a question that Tom has presented about having that's more popular to have public rooms over private rooms in the US than Europe. And why do you think that is? What we have found with escape rooms in general is escape rooms tend to copy the structure of other escape rooms in the area. And so it's interesting, when I've spoken to players from Europe, the idea of being locked in a room with strangers is not an idea they're comfortable with, as compared to in the US, where that model of being in a room with strangers is something people are more comfortable with. And when you see like things like hint systems, if you look at hint systems, they tend to all be very similar in a geographical area. If 3 hints are, the first room that starts says we have 3 hints, a lot of the rooms will have we have 3 hints. So you see that pattern when you travel and play in escape rooms, that people tend to copy what's around.
Yeah, I see the comment on, aren't escape rooms inherently cultural? Wouldn't we end up with only abstract puzzles and ciphers? And no, that's escape rooms are inherently cultural. Of course, they come from a background. The theme is culturally based, the narrative, but that doesn't mean that you can't make it as easy as possible for players to play. Even if just identifying the cultural biases in your room lets you say, okay, this group of players does not speak English well, so they may have problems with this puzzle. And so that as a GM or an owner, you're able to identify where players will most likely have problems and jump in when you need to, just to make their play experience a little more smooth. There was a particular puzzle in, gosh, I don't remember if it was in the Netherlands or not, that involved baby pictures of children. Well, anyone who was not from the Netherlands, again, this came up as an example from several players, couldn't identify because they weren't familiar with baby clothes or the baby names. So they didn't know which of these children were male or female, and that was important to solve the puzzle. And one player said to me, "Oh yeah, a friend of mine who already did that told me once you get to that puzzle, just ask for a hint and for them to tell you what players or like what babies were male or female, so that you can get through the puzzle." And that's just something to be aware of, is like, this is an area that will slow down your players.
Well, and that is one of the best practices, is that if you're going to include things in your room that are involved in your local culture, which can be good. I talk about that having rooms that tell your story, that tell your area's history and culture is good. Make sure that there is information to allow people to solve those puzzles. So for example, if you are making a vampire room and you are using the genre of vampires and the players get a stake and there's a place to stick the stake into the heart of the vampire, if they haven't been given any information that those two things go together, then it could be frustrating. So in that case, maybe you'd have a picture in the room of a vampire getting staked through the heart, or some information somewhere so that you can educate the players. And in this case, knowing where those problems exist and then creating those hints in the room to help people if they would struggle with it can be a way to resolve that.
Yeah, and a lot of rooms, that was other data that I collected that didn't fit into our analysis, but a lot of rooms had ways to help people through this common knowledge that they may not know. You know, if you're in a chemistry-based room and they need you to know elements on a periodic table, there's probably a periodic table hanging up somewhere in the room. If you need to identify landmarks, there's probably a map somewhere in the room. For the most part, I think you see a lot of that already in rooms, but you don't realize that they're helping you past this common knowledge hump by including objects in the room as, you know, kind of the environmental storytelling, but that also helps you through the puzzles.
So this brings us to the end of our hour. We'd like to thank you for joining us on this look at our data. And as I said before, we will be putting out a paper with all of this information. We'll make that available for free. We'll be doing this other survey very soon. So if you are an escape room player and you've played remote rooms in other continents and you have stories to tell about times where you ran into cultural bias, either watch the Escape Room Enthusiast Facebook group. That's a place where I'll be posting that link. Look at the BGNlab.ca blog, or give us your email address and I will notify you when that survey is ready. And then we'll do another talk like this, and we will be then giving a paper out. So any last words there, Shannon?
I think we're good.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you at the next presentation.
Bye.
Bye-bye.